Balochistan is a very large province. It is something like 40% of the area of what today constitutes Pakistan. But it's a sparsely populated, semi-arid, mountainous and desert area. It's actually in its geology and topography an extension of the Iranian plateau, geologically. So similar landscape. If you travel in Iran and if you in the countryside bordering Pakistan, if you travel in Pakistani Balochistan, you'll see the similarities. The Baloch are not indigenous to this part of the world, and there's a lot of history and myth mixed here. They are migrants to this part of the subcontinent, dating back to the 16th century and even before. And they emanate from tribes that originated, they say, around Halab or Aleppo in Syria, and some say the southern reaches of the Caspian Sea. Why this is probable is because amongst the Baloch there is a tribe called Kurd. Now the Kurds, as you know, occupy an area that transcends 4 countries: Iraq, Iran, Syria and Turkey. The areas that they describe as their areas of origin probably are contiguous to, if not part of, the area in which the Kurds today live. And since a section of the Baloch has a tribe called the Kurds in it, who are Baloch for all intents and purposes, it stands to reason that there is some linkage. Now, these migrations didn't take place in one go. They took place in waves over centuries and eventually came and settled in these areas. Now, there is also a division amongst the Baloch themselves between those who speak Balochi, and even their Balochi is divided into Eastern and Western Balochi. There are differences, but they understand each other, and Brahui. Now, there's a lot of mythology around this language, Brahui. Early ethnographists, particularly the British, tended to associate Brahui with a Dravidian language, i.e. that it was a Dravidian language and these were the original inhabitants perhaps of the Indus Valley civilization in this area, and this Brahui is the successor language of that. But that theory has been refuted to a considerable extent by later research, and probably it is not connected with any Dravidian languages and is an indigenous language of the Baloch themselves. However, not a settled issue, but I think there's a debate still about it and some research going on. Now, when they arrived in this part of the world, they were largely nomadic tribes. And that way of life, herding livestock and therefore being subject to the needs of livestock, which are the resource, implies nomadism, because the herds need to graze, and depending on the season they have to move to where the grazing grounds are. So there's a seasonal migration anyway, nomadic migration. For instance, in the summers they would tend to go up into the uplands, mountains, and in the winters they would tend to come down into the valleys and plains. This is a seasonal thing. And it exists to a considerable extent even today. Since they were tribes rather than a unified community, there is a record in the 16th century of a 30-year war between 2 major tribes, the Rinds and the Lasharis. And after 30 years of intermittent warfare, eventually the Rinds decided to migrate out of Balochistan. And in fact, they traveled towards Punjab, which today is Dera Ghazi Khan. Dera Ghazi Khan and Dera Ismail Khan, these 2 adjoining districts. Dera Ismail Khan is in Khyber Pakhtunkhwa and Dera Ghazi Khan is in Punjab. These names are taken from the names of 2 brothers who migrated from Balochistan and settled in these areas, and these districts are named after them. So you can see the connection, and there were no hard and fast boundaries in those days between Balochistan, the Baloch, and these parts of Punjab, particularly southern Punjab, where there is till today a considerable population of ethnic Baloch, but of course who are now Punjabi or Saraiki speaking and indistinguishable in that sense from the local population. Similar migrations took place into Sindh, and there is an argument, although our censuses don't highlight this, that a considerable proportion of the population of Sindh, especially in the interior rural areas, is ethnic Baloch. But of course they too have been assimilated into Sindhi culture and are Sindhi speaking, so they are indistinguishable in that sense. But the tribal names and their history and genealogy will indicate. So you can see that this wave of migrations over the centuries that I was describing into what is today Balochistan didn't stop there. It went further, it went into Sindh, it went into Punjab. But the particular migration in the 16th century of the Rinds that I'm talking about had a very significant outcome. And that was that Emperor Humayun, who had lost his throne in Delhi and taken refuge in Iran, on his march back to regain the Delhi throne, was assisted by the Baloch tribes settled in Punjab. They gave him a lashkar, a militia, fought on his side, and as reward for their cooperation, they were given lands in the area, and they are still there. Chakar Khan Rind was their leader, and he's actually buried in Punjab. So he's a great Baloch hero, Chakar Khan Rind. And it may not be remiss to mention here that my younger brother Asad Rahman, when he joined the Baloch movement, was given the party name of Chakar Khan Baloch. So you can see that name had a particular resonance. In the 18th century, there now emerges in the name of the Kalat state. Kalat is, a town and a district, a mountainous town and district in the central massif of Balochistan. There arose a Kalat state, which was essentially a confederacy of all the tribes. So suzerainty belonged to the Khan, and the tribes, vowed allegiance to him. But to all intents and purposes, their internal matters were autonomous. That's why I call it a confederacy. Whereas the Khan represented them, was the suzerain, nevertheless the tribes enjoyed considerable autonomy. That is more or less. Now, this state was a relatively weak state and was subject to the demands of stronger empires on its borders. The two in question being Kabul, Afghanistan, and Iran. So this weak state for a considerable period was a tributary state of one or either of these empires, particularly Afghanistan. So there is a symbiotic relationship between Balochistan and Afghanistan, which dates back to the 18th century. And these were, if you like, the outer reaches of the subcontinent, even in Mughal times. So they were not sought after or considered as important as perhaps the settled areas of the Indus Valley or the Ganges Valley or whatever the case may be. So kind of a benign neglect, if you like, transpired, and I think to a considerable extent that carried on long after. Now, what happens when the British colonialists enter the subcontinent and in their onward march from Bengal to UP and further up Punjab and beyond? They run up, by the time they reach the Khyber Pass, they run up against the Tsarist Russian Empire, which is vying for its own expansion at the expense of the British Empire. These are two great empires colliding now in this part of the world. And after a series of wars in Afghanistan, the British finally decide that it's not worth the ghost. So they and Tsarist Russia come to an agreement to make Afghanistan a buffer state, i.e. a buffer between these two empires, where they would vie for influence diplomatically and politically, but wouldn't be fighting wars against each other anymore. Nevertheless, during the wars of the 19th century in Afghanistan, which the British didn't come out well from, suffered defeats, they were interested in an alternative strategic route to Afghanistan, because the only one they had at that time was through the Khyber Pass. So in search of a southern strategic route, which would allow their armies to march to Afghanistan at a moment's notice, they explored the route from Sindh. They already had Sindh since 1842. Explored the route from, say, Jacobabad, Shikarpur, through Sibbi, through the Bolan Pass to the Shal Valley where Quetta now stands. It was a little village in those days. The British interest in Balochistan was not economic or political in any meaningful sense. It was more military and strategic. As I said, they sought this route to be able to guard their interests in Afghanistan. So when they attempted to march along this route and capture it, they ran up against the resistance of the Baloch tribes, the Kalat state, the Confederacy, and a series of wars ensued, which by the late 19th century ended in a stalemate. And the British then decided that, rather than fight wars in Balochistan in order to acquire this route, far better to talk to the tribes and the Kalat state and come to some modus vivendi, which is what they did. What was it? Basically, peace was agreed between the Baloch and the British. A peace treaty was signed. And the terms of it were the British would be allowed this corridor, this access, in return for not disturbing either the Kalat state or the autonomous tribes. They would remain as they were with their normal customs, traditions, ways of doing things, etc. The British would not interfere with it. And I think the sop that the British offered was purses to some of the Sardars who accepted. Purses means money, annual purses. They did that in a lot of princely states in the subcontinent, by the way. Bought the loyalties of not just tribal chieftains, but even princes and maharajas by offering them money. And secondly, they offered the tribes as a sop or as an incentive the creation of a tribal law and order force called the levies, which still exist. Now, what was that? Essentially, the levies were recruited from the local tribes, paid for by the British, and maintained law and order within the autonomous tribes. They did not interfere with or intervene in the areas that the British held. And as the British consolidated this route, they built a cantonment where Quetta now stands. Quetta, a small village, was then transformed into a city. It's the city that you see today. Now, this system, which came to be known as the Sandeman system, Fort Sandeman is a small town in Balochistan. Sandeman was a British civil servant, and he is supposed to be the author of this policy. He, when he came across and became acquainted with the Baloch tribes and their culture, he advised the British that, these people are different from the Pashtun tribes that we've encountered in NWFP, what is today Khyber Pakhtunkhwa. And rather than employ the same means which Olaf Caro, one of the governors of NWFP, has, delineated in his book, and he talks of gold and guns on the frontier being the main sort of instrument for keeping the tribes quiet. So Sandeman said these people are different, their culture is different. I think we need to treat them differently. I think if we give them respect and autonomy and a few incentives, maybe we can come to some kind of agreement with them, and that's exactly what happened. That system, more or less intact, is what Pakistan, the post-colonial state, inherited and has continued with some modifications over the years in response to changing circumstances. But more or less that system still exists. Now, the corridor the British controlled came to be known, because it was under British administration, as British Balochistan. And the rest was the autonomous Kalat state with autonomous tribes. Now, when independence was looming in the mid-20th century, there was a question about princely states. And the manner in which the question of princely states was settled left a lot to be desired, but nevertheless the idea was basically that Muslim majority states would go to Pakistan if they were contiguous with the areas in the northwest and northeast that came to constitute Pakistan, or would go to India if they were Hindu majority or contiguous with Indian territory. There are exceptions to that, of course, Hyderabad being one of them, Kashmir being one of them. But anyway, those are different questions. Now, the British were inclined to treat the Kalat state as also a princely state, something that was rejected by the Khan, because his argument was that we are not a princely state in the same sense as the conquered princely states in the rest of the subcontinent. We are in fact a treaty state. We have treaties with the British Crown dating back to the late 19th century, which recognize our autonomy, if not our independence. And therefore we are not in the same position, and we must be allowed to negotiate our fate and our future in the middle of the negotiations and independence struggles that were going on in the subcontinent against the British, which, as you know, came to be based on the divide between the Muslim minority and the Hindu majority, so-called, and a division along political lines, Congress representing the latter and Muslim League representing the former. In the middle of all this, the Baloch or the Kalat state takes its different position and its claim to be treated differently. The argument was that since we are a treaty state, once the British leave, we revert back to our pre-treaty status. And as such, we must be allowed the right of self-determination, whether we want to join Pakistan, because they can't join India, they're not contiguous with India, that option is really not there, not practical, or independence. And this case, after a lot of negotiations with the British, went up as high as the Privy Council, which was in British colonial structures the ultimate appeals authority, if you like, on issues of politics and so on. And the brilliant constitutional lawyer that the Khan of Kalat hired to argue Balochistan's case, particularly in the Privy Council, was none other than Qaid-e-Azam Muhammad Ali Jinnah. There is irony here, I'll explain. When independence came, the issue had not yet been settled, the issue of Balochistan. The arguments were still out there, they were in the air, but they were overtaken by bigger events in the subcontinent, independence, partition, all that accompanied partition. So this kind of got left on the back burner. When Pakistan came into being, the very council of the Khan of Kalat became the Governor General. And suddenly he was overtaken in turn by the events surrounding partition, and particularly the war in Kashmir, which broke out very early after independence, winter of 47-48. Those bigger issues therefore impinged on the national narrative or the concerns of the new state. And there was a degree of a sense of impatience with what was considered peripheral issues like the status of the Kalat state. And that impatience, after a series of negotiations which came to nothing, ended up in what the Khan of Kalat has written in his book as a forcible annexation. He was invited to Karachi for talks, and according to him, literally at the point of a gun, made to sign the annexation document. Now, why was that rejected by the Baloch? Because of two reasons. One is that whereas Pakistan came into being on the 14th of August 1947, 3 days earlier, on the 11th of August 1947, the Baloch houses, upper and lower, of their parliament The upper house was composed of sardars and chieftains, and the lower house of commoners. Met in a joint session on the 11th of August and decided to opt for independence. 3 days later, Pakistan comes into being, and that resolution, unanimous resolution, is ignored. Hence the negotiations between the Khan and the Qaid and so on and so forth. Now, as I said, the context in which I've placed it is, the events of independence and partition, the war with India over Kashmir, and so all these things impinging on and pushing aside, if you like, issues like Balochistan as secondary importance. In March 1948, the Khan of Kalat is forced to sign the instrument of accession, rejected by the Baloch because of, as I said, their sentiment on the 11th of August 1947. And from there stems then the whole history of rebellion in Balochistan, armed rebellion in Balochistan, and how it was dealt with. The first rebellion after the March 1948 forcible annexation is led by none other than the Khan's younger brother, Agha Abdul Karim. Goes up into the mountains on the Afghan-Balochistan border and wages a tribal resistance, tribal armed resistance in the traditional style. Now, how that is dealt with is symptomatic of how things then developed inside Pakistan vis-a-vis Balochistan. He and his followers were invited on oath on the Holy Quran to come down from the mountains and negotiate their demands. They did and were promptly arrested and bunged in jail. This was the first broken promise. And there are a whole series after this. Agha Abdul Karim spent the next 16 out of the next 22 years in jail. And his colleagues or his compatriots suffered more or less similar fates. So that engendered bitterness, obviously, that, here was a breach of an oath on the Quran and a promise. And, this kind of thing, then you begin to see, becomes the norm in Pakistan's dealing with the Baloch problem. I think that is true. I don't think the Khan was in favor of an armed rebellion. He certainly didn't encourage his brother. In fact, there's some evidence that he tried to discourage and to bring him back into the fold, but I don't think he succeeded. No, certainly the Khan was of a temperament which wanted to negotiate Balochistan's rights or Kalat state's rights with the new state of Pakistan rather than take up arms against it. But nevertheless, he and people like him, moderate people like him, were overtaken by the march of events. When you have a situation where an insurgency breaks out, even if it is small, and you have a situation where that insurgency is crushed through devious means, then obviously the bitterness deepens and the moderate voices get drowned. That happened in 48. And I think that set the tone for relations between Pakistan, Islamabad, and the capital, Karachi at that time, and Balochistan per se. Now, between 1948 and 1958, there is, in terms of insurgency, relative quiet in Balochistan. Once Agha Abdul Karim's movement has been overcome, there is no record of any other armed insurrection for these 10 years. What happens in 1958? This is an important turning point. You may know that after 9 years of debating, discussing and quarreling in the Constituent Assembly, Pakistan finally got a constitution in 1956. And part of the debate which held up an agreement or a conclusion about what sort of constitution the new state should have was precisely the federal structure of the state. East Pakistan, despite being a smaller territory, had a majority population in Pakistan as a whole. So any scheme that followed the normal democratic scheme of one man, one vote would end up in the minds of the powers that were in this Pakistani state as a permanent dominance by East Pakistan politically. They found that unacceptable. Now, why did they find that unacceptable? That needs some delineation. It was felt that Bengali nationalism, which kind of, came out of the womb of Pakistani or Muslim nationalism pre-independence, was too radical and could be a source of trouble for the state. And there are indications to that effect very early on in the history of Pakistan. For instance, I had mentioned before that Mr. Jinnah's view was that Pakistan needed now to be unified. There was a problem. Two wings separated, not only by 1,000 miles of hostile Indian territory, but also by culture, history, language, so many other things. Now, how to unify them? In his view, the best way was to have one national language, which would be the lingua franca and would, become the cement, the bond that would bring these two wings together. And he suggested this in a visit to East Pakistan, Dhaka, in 1948, which resulted in riots by the students because they weren't about to give up Bengali as their language. So the language movement of East Pakistan dates to that incident, and some students were killed in the process. They are martyrs in the history of what is today Bangladesh and still commemorated. So you can see where the problem arose. A majority resides in East Pakistan. They are Bengali. Their Bengali nationalism has contributed considerably to the Pakistan movement. It was one of the main centers of the Pakistan movement. And yet, now that Pakistan has come into being, they are asserting their historically evolved cultural, linguistic, other identity. Now, what is Pakistan to be then? Is it going to be a unified state or not? On the evidence of the language movement of 48, no. I mean, wisdom would have dictated, or logic would have dictated, that just as the successor state India was composed of so many different nationalities with so many different languages, which they recognized and accepted not as national languages, but as state languages. And when they tried to impose a national language, actually Hindi, the South revolted. And so they chose English as the bond or linking language rather than insisting on Hindi, which was largely a northern Indian language. Something similar, hindsight and wisdom seems to indicate, would have served Pakistan better than the attempt, and it became a kind of forced attempt to keep Pakistan together and to provide some kind of bonding which otherwise didn't exist. Clearly, religion was not going to be enough, despite the fact that, the Muslim community had fought for its rights to begin with, for autonomy later, and finally for independence. And do not forget that when Pakistan came into being in 1947, more Muslims were left behind in India than came to Pakistan, okay? So clearly, not all Muslims of the subcontinent, undivided subcontinent, were sufficiently persuaded by the argument of Mr. Jinnah and the Muslim League to want to uproot themselves, leave their hearts, homes, and their, soil, and move to the new state. These are the realities. I'm not making a case here, it's just a fact. So because that wisdom did not prevail that I'm talking about recognizing Pakistan as two wings, separated by considerable territory, hostile Indian territory, and diverse. Had that been recognized then, and the structure, federal structure, created to take account of that reality, I do not think we would have suffered many of the problems that we did later. But instead, because the powerful institutions of the state, which were inherited from British rule, were the army and the bureaucracy. And these two combined constituted arguably a more considerable or powerful force than the politicians could muster. So I think there was an element of collaboration with what today we would call the establishment. Okay? And since these institutions of state were predominantly from Punjab, that's where Punjab begins to get its reputation in the rest of Pakistan as an oppressor. So what was the scheme of the 56 Constitution, which went against the grain of the democratic principle of one man, one vote, because, as I said, of the fear of a permanent majority of East Pakistan? They created what is known in the 56 Constitution as parity. Parity between the two wings, i.e. the representation of East Pakistan and West Pakistan in Parliament and the National Assembly of Pakistan would be equal, which meant that the vote of the East Pakistani citizen was going to have less weight than the vote of the citizen from West Pakistan, because less people elected the same number of seats and more people also elected the same number of seats. So obviously their individual vote lost some weight in the process. So this weightage or parity is how the 56 Constitution defined the structure of the state. Not only that, it went further. The historical existence of provinces in what was then West Pakistan was obliterated. How was it obliterated? Obliterated by creating out of West Pakistan what came to be known as one unit. And it was created precisely with the same thinking which dictated parity, which is as a counterweight to the otherwise dominant majority of East Pakistan, i.e. bring all these provinces of West Pakistan in one administrative structure so that they can become a counterweight, if you like, or have enough weight, if you like, to be able to balance the majority of East Pakistan. You can see that this is a false construct. Now, it had two implications or two fallouts. One is obviously it was not popular in East Pakistan because it violated the fundamental democratic principle of one man, one vote, and clearly biased against East Pakistan, against their rights. Second, it annoyed the provinces, the other provinces of West Pakistan, which at that time were Northwest Frontier Province, today Khyber Pakhtunkhwa, Balochistan, and Sindh. Now, the phenomenon of subnationalism, which is what has been dubbed subnationalism in Pakistan today, stems from this creation of one unit. Each of these three provinces, irritated beyond measure by this obliteration of their identity, historically evolved and well settled over centuries, the sentiment turned against this arrangement. So you had nationalism arising in Sindh, you had nationalism arising in NWFP, which also had this baggage of the link historically with Afghanistan. There were Pashtuns across the border. The British had drawn a line or a border called the Durand Line, which the Pashtuns claim to this day cleft their people into two, their nation into two. So the Pashtuns in Afghanistan were left that side and the Pashtuns in Pakistan were on this side. And hence that nationalism had an irredentist character. And the demand for many years for Pashtunistan was essentially located in this irredentism, which is why it was treated as anti-state always. In Balochistan too, the resentment against this obliteration continued, and what happened in 1958 was the following. Now I'm coming back. In 1958, a crisis overtook what had become a series of governments that came into power, lasted not more than a few months, and then were overturned in the assembly and a new one came into power. This game went on in the 2 years between the promulgation of the 56 Constitution and October 58, I think something like 11 governments in 2 years. So you can see how unstable the situation was. And basically, the political class proved to be quite unprincipled, and if anything, what we would recognize easily today, a relatively easily saleable commodity. That's why all these governments toppled and new ones came and kept coming. Now, in 1958, President Iskandar Mirza, who was with a background, a military and bureaucratic background, collaborated with his commander-in-chief of the Pakistan Army at that time, General Ayub Khan, and launched a military coup which overthrew the ostensibly elected government that had been put in place by the Constituent Assembly. No election had taken place. Elections were due in 59 under the 56 Constitution, but they had not yet taken place. So the elections were preempted. Why were they preempted? Because I think in the view of the establishment, the way politics was going in Pakistan, given, as I said, the discrediting of the political class for its maneuvers and its inability to stick to anything or stick to any principle, and showing themselves to be totally opportunist, they had lost credibility. There was a rising sentiment from below, which in the view of the establishment was going leftwards. And left at that time meant National Army Party, NAP. And at that time, the major figure, the split had not yet taken place. The major figures in NAP were Maulana Bhashani, who was from East Pakistan, and Khan Abdul Wali Khan, who was the son of Khan Abdul Ghaffar Khan, Bacha Khan, the frontier Gandhi. So I think there was a great fear in the establishment. The left was coming to power if the elections were free and fair. And so to preempt that possibility, by now Pakistan was already in the Western orbit. We were already in military pacts, CENTO and SEATO, with the Western Alliance, and part of the anti-communist front, if you like. So if the left had come into power, you can imagine what would have happened, and the fears, apprehensions that accompanied that possibility. So to preempt such an outcome, the coup was intended A, to prevent any such outcome of the 59 election. B, something very significant. What was the justification for the coup? One of the justifications for the coup, one of course was the inability of the politicians to provide a stable government, but the other one, and more significant to our discussion right now, was that the Khan of Kalat was accused of preparing a rebellion to break Balochistan away from Pakistan. There is no evidence that the Khan of Kalat was actually doing this. And given the Khan's temperament, we talked about 1948, a very unlikely accusation. Nevertheless, the military was sent to Kalat. He was arrested, after some token resistance by his personal guard, and brought to Lahore and kept under house arrest in Gulberg in Lahore for a considerable time. I am a witness as a child to having passed by that house, because it was very near my house and we used to cycle there, and there was a flag on top, the Kalat flag. And of course we were curious because we weren't allowed anywhere near that house. There was an armed guard and we were shooed away. This was in P Block Gulberg, by the way, corner house. So of course curiosity, children's curiosity, what is going on here? What is going on in this house? Why are we not allowed near it? So on and so forth. And then we learned that the Khan of Kalat was being kept in house arrest here, and that is why it was off limits. Now we had no clue who the Khan of Kalat was or why he was there. Of course we were children, but curiosity, what is going on here? But I remember that very well. And it came back to haunt me later, when I became more acquainted with Balochistan as an older person. Now obviously when the Khan was arrested, the impact on the tribal confederacy can only be imagined. And the first rebellion in response to the Khan's arrest was by an elderly tribal chieftain called Nauroz Khan, who was all of 90 years old, by the way. And under his leadership, the first revolt broke out. Now, what happened to Agha Abdul Karim is repeated here again. On oath on the Quran, he and his followers were asked to come down from the mountains and negotiate, and as soon as they did, they were arrested, put in jail, and 9 of his sons and nephews were hanged subsequently. Nawroz Khan, being old, was spared hanging, but he died in jail. Old man. Try to put yourself in the shoes of the Baloch. Okay? You can imagine the anger, the resentment, the false accusation against the Khan, his arrest, being kept under house arrest, and then again a dishonorable broken promise as far as this rebellion was concerned. These were tribal rebellions. I'm making it very clear. Why do I keep saying tribal rebellion? Because this was not modern guerrilla warfare or anything, and this was not informed by a modern ideology or anything. It was basically reactions, responses, armed response, which was the traditional response of the Baloch tribes, whether it was the British or anybody else. Okay, so it's the same pattern. In 1962 then, 62-63, another rebellion broke out, post Nawroz Khan, and that was in the Mari area. The Maris are the largest tribe in Balochistan. Their area, the Mari area, is adjacent to the Bugti area. And these are the areas, tribal areas, north of Sibi, or north of the Pat feeder. The Pat feeder is a canal, major canal in Balochistan. It's called Pat feeder because that area is an alluvial clay plain built up over the centuries by the mountain torrents bringing down soil and then spreading it in sheet flooding across that plain. It's flat as a pancake, and it is so without any landmark that you can get lost in it, wander around in circles and die of thirst. It has that reputation. It's as bad as a desert. So these are the areas north of that. And in fact, they are mountainous areas. And so the Mari rebellion broke out. And that rebellion went on till Ayub Khan was finally overthrown. Now this is Ayub Khan we're dealing with, because within 2 months of the coup, he had overthrown Iskandar Mirza and taken over himself. And then of course elevated himself to Field Marshal and all the other things that happened in Ayub Khan's 10 years. So this now guerrilla war in Mari area is a mixture of the traditional tribal and modern guerrilla warfare. Something new is being introduced. And the clan leader, chieftain who led it, although the Sardar was Nawab Khair Bakhsh Mari, but he was sitting in Quetta or Karachi, but the rebellion was led by Sher Mohammad Mari. The Mari tribe is composed of 3 major sections. There's the Sardar Khail, where the clan where the Sardars come from, which is called Ghazeni. There is the Loharani, which is a smaller section. And then there is the major section, the majority, which is the Bijrani. So Sher Mohammad Mari was from the Bijrani clan, and the Bijrani clan was in the forefront, but all the other clans were part of this struggle from 62 to 69 when Ayub was eventually overthrown. There were also subsequent rebellions in the area south of the Bolan, which is, there are 2 areas in particular called Sarawan and Jalawan. These are mountainous areas. The major tribe there is Bengals in Jalawan, and the major tribe in Sarawan are the Zehris. So you can see that the tribal structures inherited from the past in Baloch society were still intact, operative, and the rebellions took the form of essentially tribal rebellions based on tribes, but in the case of the Mari rebellion, a notch above in terms of modern guerrilla warfare entering the scene. The it can only be called an armed resistance. The resistance was not defeated, despite the use of the Air Force, overwhelming military force, and so on and so forth. But the guerrillas could not be defeated. And so this war went on until in 68-69, an agitation broke out all over Pakistan against Ayub's rule and eventually ended in his displacement, Yahya Khan taking over with the imposition of another martial law in April 1969. And as soon as Ayub left and Yahya came in, the military decided that, the kind of mobilization that, the movement went on for something like 7 months. The whole of Pakistan was on the streets, east and west. You cannot imagine what that was like. This Mall Road of Lahore of yours, initiated by students, but eventually when the working class entered it, and it was organized in those days in trade unions, no longer, 7 months of countrywide agitation, which drew in more and more sections of the people until the whole people were out there on the streets against Ayub Khan, convinced the establishment, the military in particular, that some lessons must be learned and some things that were done in the manner that Ayub did them must be undone and reversed. And what were those things? First and foremost, he announced elections. Pakistan had not had a general election till then. Are you aware of that? The Constituent Assembly, which came into being in 1947, was drawn from the older assemblies from the provinces. No election was held. The constitution was not made until 9 years, and before an election could be held under that constitution, the military coup overtook it. And then the elections that Ayub held cannot answer to the description of democratic. They were manipulated elections. Okay? So a free and fair democratic election, Pakistan had never experienced.